the desperate song from the Old Gramophone. The antique shop. The bell above the door jingled softly as Clara stepped into the dimly lit antique shop. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. It was a strange, almost metallic tang, like the smell of rain on old iron. The shop was cluttered with relics of the past. Porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished silverware, faded oil paintings, and shelves upon shelves of books with spines so worn their titles were illegible. Clara had always been drawn to places like this, places where time seemed to stand still, where the past lingered like a ghost. She wasn't sure what had brought her here today. She had been walking aimlessly through the city, her mind heavy with thoughts of her upcoming graduation and the uncertainty of what came next. The weight of the future pressed down on her, and she had found herself wandering into this part of town, a part she rarely visited. The shop had caught her eye, its windows filled with curiosities that seemed to call to her. As she wandered through the aisles, her fingers trailing over the surfaces of old furniture and trinkets, something caught her eye. It was a gramophone, its brass horn gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was an old model, the kind with a hand crank, and it looked as though it had been well cared for. The wood of its base was polished to a soft sheen, and the intricate carvings along its edges were still sharp and clear. Clara approached it slowly, as if afraid it might vanish if she moved too quickly. She reached out and touched the crank, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. There was something about it, something that made her heart beat a little faster. She turned the crank experimentally, and to her surprise, the gramophone whirred to life. The turntable began to spin, and a soft, scratchy sound filled the air. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint at first, but as the turntable gained speed, it grew louder. It was music, a melody that seemed to wrap around her, pulling her in. The song was haunting, filled with a longing that resonated deep within her. It was a song she had never heard before, and yet it felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Clara closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. It was beautiful, but there was something else, something beneath the surface. A desperation, a plea. The song seemed to be telling a story, one of love and loss, of dreams unfulfilled and promises broken. It was a story that felt achingly personal, as if it had been written just for her. When the song ended, Clara opened her eyes, feeling as though she had been pulled out of a dream. The shop was silent once more, the gramophone's turntable slowing to a stop. She looked around, half expecting to see someone watching her, but the shop was empty. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere in the distance. Clara's heart was still racing, her mind filled with the echoes of the song. She knew she had to have the gramophone. There was no question about it. She found the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a kind face and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He smiled at her as she approached, as if he had been expecting her. "I'd like to buy the gramophone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man nodded, his smile widening. "Ah, the gramophone. A fine choice. It's been here for a long time, waiting for the right person to take it home." Clara frowned, puzzled by his words. "Waiting for me?" The man's eyes twinkled. "Everything in this shop has a story, my dear, and that gramophone, well, let's just say it's been waiting for someone like you." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She paid for the gramophone, the man wrapping it carefully in brown paper and tying it with string. As she left the shop, the bell jingling softly behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The weight of the future still pressed down on her, but now there was something else, a faint glimmer of hope. She carried the gramophone home, setting it up in the corner of her small apartment. She cranked it again, and the song played once more, filling the room with its haunting melody. Clara sat on the floor, listening, letting the music wash over her. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. The first change. Clara woke the next morning with the melody still echoing in her mind. The song had played on a loop in her dreams, weaving itself into her thoughts until it felt like a part of her. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. The gramophone sat in the corner of her room, silent now, but she could still feel its presence, as if it were watching her. Finally, she got up and made her way to the kitchen, her mind still foggy with sleep. She put on a pot of coffee and sat at the small table, staring out the window at the city below. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the buildings. It was a beautiful morning, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and saw a text from her best friend, Mia. "Hey, you free for lunch today? I need to talk to you about something." Clara frowned. Mia's texts were usually light and casual, but this one felt different. There was an urgency to it that made Clara's stomach twist. She quickly typed out a reply. "Yeah, of course. What's up?" Mia's response came almost immediately. "I'll tell you when I see you. Meet me at the usual place at noon?" Clara agreed, her mind racing. She and Mia had been friends since childhood, and they told each other everything. If something was bothering Mia enough to make her text like that, it had to be serious. Clara spent the rest of the morning trying to distract herself, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the gramophone. She found herself standing in front of it, staring at the brass horn as if it might suddenly start playing again. She reached out and touched the crank, but she didn't turn it. There was something about the song that felt too powerful, too real. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear it again. When it was time to meet Mia, Clara grabbed her bag and headed out the door. The cafe where they usually met was just a few blocks away, and the walk helped clear her head a little. By the time she arrived, she was feeling more like herself. Mia was already there, sitting at their usual table by the window. She looked up as Clara approached, and Clara could see the worry in her eyes. "Hey," Mia said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Clara replied, sitting down across from her. "What's going on? You sounded really serious in your text." Mia sighed, playing with the straw in her drink. "It's complicated. I don't even know how to start." Clara reached across the table and took Mia's hand. "You can tell me anything, you know that?" Mia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm pregnant." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been expecting that. "Oh, Mia. I don't know what to do," Mia said, her voice breaking. "I'm scared, Clara. I'm not ready for this. I don't know if I'll ever be ready." Clara squeezed her hand, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say. Mia was only 22, just like her. They were both still in school, trying to figure out their lives. A baby. It was a lot to take in. "Have you told anyone else?" Clara asked gently. Mia shook her head. "No, just you. I don't know how my parents will react. They've always had such high expectations for me. This isn't part of the plan." Clara nodded, understanding. Mia's parents were strict, traditional. They had always pushed her to excel, to follow a certain path. A baby would change everything. "What about the father?" Clara asked. Mia looked down at the table, her cheeks flushing. "It's complicated. He's not really in the picture." Clara sighed, her heart aching for her friend. "Mia, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say, but whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. You're not alone in this." Mia looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Clara. That means a lot." They sat there for a long time, talking and crying, trying to make sense of the situation. By the time they left the cafe, Clara felt emotionally drained. She walked home in a daze, her mind filled with thoughts of Mia and the baby and the uncertain future. When she got back to her apartment, the gramophone was still sitting in the corner, silent and still. Clara stared at it for a long time, her heart heavy. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, as if it held some kind of answer. Finally, she walked over to it and turned the crank. The turntable began to spin, and the song started to play. The haunting melody filled the room, wrapping around her like a blanket. Clara closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. And then, something strange happened. The song changed. It was still the same melody, but the notes were different, the tempo slower, more somber. Clara opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The gramophone was playing a different version of the song, one that felt even more desperate, more pleading. As the song played, Clara felt a strange sensation, as if the room were shifting around her. The air grew colder, and the light dimmed. She looked around, her breath catching in her throat. The walls of her apartment seemed to fade away, replaced by a different scene. She was standing in a hospital room, the walls a sterile white. Mia was there, lying in a bed, her face pale and drawn. She was holding a baby, her eyes filled with tears. Clara's heart ached as she watched her friend, feeling the weight of her pain. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision faded. Clara was back in her apartment, the gramophone song coming to an end. She stumbled back, her legs trembling. What had just happened? Had she imagined it? Or had the gramophone shown her something real? Clara didn't know, but one thing was certain. The gramophone was more than just an old relic. It had power, a power that could change things. And Clara had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The vision. Clara sat on the floor of her apartment, her back against the wall, staring at the gramophone. Her heart was still racing, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The vision, if that's what it was, had felt so real, so vivid. She could still see Mia's face, pale and tear-streaked, as she held the baby in her arms. The pain in her eyes had been almost too much to bear. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She needed to think, to figure out what was happening. The gramophone wasn't just playing songs. It was showing her things that hadn't happened yet. But how? And why? She thought back to the shopkeeper, the way he had smiled at her when she bought the gramophone. "It's been waiting for someone like you," he had said. At the time, she had thought it was just a figure of speech, but now she wasn't so sure. Had he known what the gramophone could do? Had he known it would show her these things? Clara shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She needed to focus. The vision of Mia in the hospital. Was that the future? Was that what was going to happen if Mia kept the baby? Or was it a warning? A glimpse of what could be if things didn't change? She didn't know, but she couldn't just sit there and do nothing. She had to talk to Mia, to tell her what she had seen. But how could she explain it? Mia would think she was crazy. Hell, Clara wasn't even sure she wasn't crazy herself. She got up and paced the room, her mind racing. The gramophone sat silently in the corner, its brass horn gleaming faintly in the dim light. Clara stopped in front of it, staring at it as if it might suddenly start speaking to her. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The gramophone didn't answer, of course. It just sat there, silent and still. Clara reached out and touched the crank, but she didn't turn it. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear the song again, to see another vision. But she knew she couldn't ignore it. The gramophone had shown her something important, something she couldn't just forget. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mia's number. It rang a few times before Mia picked up. "Hey," Mia said, her voice sounding tired. "Hey," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I need to see you. It's important." Mia sighed. "Okay, I'll be there in a bit." Clara hung up and sat down on the couch, her heart pounding. She didn't know how she was going to explain this to Mia, but she knew she had to try. The vision had been too real, too vivid to ignore. When Mia arrived, she looked even more tired than she had at the cafe. She sat down on the couch next to Clara, her eyes filled with worry. "What's going on?" she asked. "You sounded really serious on the phone." Clara took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I need to tell you something. It's going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear me out." Mia frowned, but she nodded. "Okay, what is it?" Clara told her everything about the gramophone, the song, the vision. She didn't leave anything out, even though she knew how it sounded. Mia listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Clara finished, there was a long pause. Mia stared at her, her eyes wide. You saw me? In the hospital?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "I know it sounds crazy, but it felt so real. I think it was a warning. I think the gramophone was trying to show me something. Mia shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Clara, this is insane. How could a gramophone show you the future? It doesn't make any sense. I know, Clara said, her voice trembling, but I can't just ignore it. What if it's real? What if it's trying to tell us something? Mia looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. I don't know, Clara. I don't know what to think. Clara reached out and took Mia's hand. I'm not saying you have to believe me. I needed to tell you. I needed you to know. Mia nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. I'm scared, Clara. I don't know what to do. Clara squeezed her hand, her heart aching for her friend. Whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. We'll figure this out together. They sat there for a long time, holding hands, trying to make sense of the impossible. The gramophone sat silently in the corner, its presence looming over them like a shadow. Clara didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew one thing for certain. The song wasn't finished, and neither were they. The second vision. The days that followed were a blur for Clara. She couldn't stop thinking about the vision, about Mia and the baby. She had tried to push it out of her mind, to focus on her studies and her job, but it was always there, lurking in the back of her thoughts like a shadow. Mia had been quiet since their conversation, withdrawn and distant. Clara knew she was struggling, but she didn't know how to help. She had tried to talk to her, to offer support, but Mia had shut her out, saying she needed time to think. Clara had respected her space, but it was hard. She felt helpless, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching her friend teeter on the brink. She wanted to do something, anything, but she didn't know what. And then, one night, the gramophone played again. Clara had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She had almost drifted off when she heard it, the soft, scratchy sound of the gramophone starting up. She sat up, her heart pounding. The room was dark, but she could see the faint glow of the gramophone's brass horn in the corner. The turntable was spinning, the needle tracing the grooves of the record. The song began to play, the haunting melody filling the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't touched the gramophone, hadn't turned the crank. It had started on its own. She got out of bed and walked over to the gramophone, her legs trembling. The song was different this time, the notes sharper, more urgent. The desperation in the melody was palpable, as if the song itself were pleading with her. And then, just like before, the room began to shift. The walls faded away, replaced by a different scene. Clara found herself standing in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke. There was a man sitting at a table, his head in his hands. He looked up, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was Mia's ex-boyfriend, the one who had gotten her pregnant. He looked different, though older, more worn. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with worry. Clara watched as he picked up a phone and dialed a number. He waited, his hands shaking, and then he spoke. "Mia? It's me. I need to see you. We need to talk." There was a pause, and then he nodded. "Okay, I'll be there." He hung up and put his head in his hands again, his shoulders shaking. Clara felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Where had he been all this time? Why had he left Mia to deal with this alone? The vision faded, and Clara was back in her apartment. The gramophone song came to an end, the turntable slowing to a stop. Clara stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. She sat on the floor, her mind reeling. What had she just seen? Was it another vision of the future? Or was it happening right now? She didn't know, but she couldn't just sit there and do nothing. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mia's number. It rang a few times before Mia picked up. "Clara?" Mia's voice sounded groggy, as if she had just woken up. "Mia, I need to see you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It's important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's going on?" I can't explain over the phone. Please, just come over." Mia sighed. Okay, I'll be there in a bit. Clara hung up and sat on the floor, her heart pounding. She didn't know how she was going to explain this to Mia, but she knew she had to try. The vision had been too real, too urgent to ignore. When Mia arrived, she looked even more tired than before. She sat down on the couch next to Clara, her eyes filled with worry. "What's going on?" she asked. "You sounded really serious on the phone." Clara took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I need to tell you something. It's going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear me out." Mia frowned, but she nodded. "Okay, what is it?" Clara told her everything about the gramophone, the song, the vision. She didn't leave anything out, even though she knew how it sounded. Mia listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Clara finished, there was a long pause. Mia stared at her, her eyes wide. You saw him? Talking to me?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "I know it sounds crazy, but it felt so real. I think he's going to call you. Or maybe he already has." Mia shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and fear. "Clara, this is insane. How could a gramophone show you the future? It doesn't make any sense." "I know," Clara said, her voice trembling, "but I can't just ignore it. What if it's real? What if it's trying to tell us something?" Mia looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know, Clara. I don't know what to think." Clara reached out and took Mia's hand. "I'm not saying you have to believe me. I needed to tell you. I needed you to know." Mia nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared, Clara. I don't know what to do." Clara squeezed her hand, her heart aching for her friend. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. We'll figure this out together." They sat there for a long time, holding hands, trying to make sense of the impossible. The gramophone sat silently in the corner, its presence looming over them like a shadow. Clara didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew one thing for certain. The song wasn't finished, and neither were they. The final note. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Clara and Mia. The vision Clara had seen, of Mia's ex-boyfriend reaching out, had come true. He had called Mia, asking to meet and talk. Mia had been hesitant, but Clara had encouraged her to go, to hear him out. Whatever the gramophone was showing her, it felt important, as if it were guiding them towards something. The meeting had been tense, but it had also been a turning point. Mia's ex had apologized, admitting that he had been scared and overwhelmed. He wanted to be a part of the baby's life, to support Mia in any way he could. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Mia had come back from the meeting with a glimmer of hope in her eyes, something Clara hadn't seen in weeks. But even as things seemed to be looking up for Mia, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the gramophone song. The visions had been too real, too vivid to be mere coincidences. The gramophone was trying to tell her something, to show her something important, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. One night, as she lay in bed, the gramophone began to play again. The song was different this time, the melody softer, more melancholic. Clara sat up, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. The room began to shift, the walls fading away as the vision took hold. Clara found herself standing in a small, cozy living room. The walls were painted a warm yellow, and the room was filled with the soft glow of fairy lights. There was a Christmas tree in the corner, its branches adorned with ornaments and tinsel. Mia was there, sitting on the couch with a baby in her arms. She was smiling, her eyes filled with love and joy. The baby was giggling, its tiny hands reaching up to touch Mia's face. Clara felt a lump in her throat as she watched them, her heart swelling with emotion. And then, she saw him, Mia's ex-boyfriend. He was sitting on the floor, playing with a toddler who looked just like him. He was laughing, his eyes filled with happiness. The room was filled with love, with the warmth of a family. The vision faded, and Clara was back in her apartment. The gramophone song came to an end, the turntable slowing to a stop. Clara sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face. The vision had been so beautiful, so full of hope. It was a glimpse of what could be, of what Mia's future could hold. Clara knew what she had to do. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mia's number. "We'll figure this out together." They sat there for a long time, holding hands, trying to make sense of the impossible. The gramophone sat silently in the corner, its presence looming over them like a shadow. Clara didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew one thing for certain. The song wasn't finished, and neither were they. As the days turned into weeks, Mia began to make decisions about her future. She decided to keep the baby, to give it a chance at life. Her ex-boyfriend stepped up, promising to be there for her and the child. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but there was hope. Clara watched as Mia's life began to change, as the vision she had seen started to come true. The gramophone remained silent, its song finished for now, but Clara knew that it wasn't the end. The gramophone had shown her the power of hope, of love, of second chances, and she knew that, no matter what the future held, she would always be there for Mia, just as she had promised. The gramophone sat in the corner of her apartment, silent and still, but Clara knew that its song would play again, when the time was right. And when it did, she would be ready.